Good evening and welcome once again. Thank you for joining us at this special program. My name, as Anna said, is Melissa Mendelson, and I am the Director of Programs here at the Health Sciences Library and Future Knowledge Center. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to first point out that we have 4 houses joining us today, and you all have self-sorted into these houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Slytherin, and Ravenclaw. Please take note of where you are seated, as each of the houses will be competing in a trivia activity throughout tonight's presentation. You will be asked a series of questions, and correct answers will result in points awarded to each house. Please stand to be called on to give your answer. The house with the most points will receive a prize. You will also have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation. And now our speaker. Dr. Joel A. Klein is a lecturer and postdoctoral researcher with the Making and Knowing Project in the Department of History at Columbia University. He is also a research fellow at the Chemical Heritage Foundation in Philadelphia, where he is working on a manuscript about 17th century chemistry and medicine in Germany. Before working at Columbia and the Chemical Heritage Foundation, Dr. Klein was a Fulbright scholar in Leipzig, Germany, and had a fellowship at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Joel Klein.
Thank you, Melissa. So first, let me extend my warm thanks to the Health Sciences Library for giving me the opportunity to speak on this subject. I'm very excited to be able to talk to you about Harry Potter and the history of science and medicine, and my hope is that you will leave here tonight with some of that excitement. I'm not the biggest Harry Potter fan, but I have read the books and I've seen the movies, and my guess is some of you, the ones who dressed up, might put me to shame with Harry Potter trivia. So I don't know if these questions are going to be very difficult or very easy. We'll just see. So some of you will be leaving with jelly beans. But there are 4 houses, and only the members of one house will go home tonight with Bertie Bott's Every Flavor jelly beans, which include wonderful flavors like booger and vomit. So again, you help your house win. I'll ask questions, jump up, and whoever stands up first will get a chance to answer. If you get the question wrong, the person who has stood up second from a different house will be able to answer. So in between, I'll be talking about the history of alchemy, the history of science, and it'll be a good time. Now, I know that some of you are placed into Slytherin, and I just want to say that I'm sorry to all of the other houses. I'm sorry to all of the other houses that we even let these reprobates into the building. So I should also warn you before I start, it looks like you're all adults. The history of alchemy is surprisingly sexy, and aspects of this talk are rated PG-13. The last time I gave this talk, everyone who showed up was between the ages of 7 and 11, and you will see why that is extremely awkward. The Harry Potter books, movies, theme parks, etc. have inspired and delighted millions of people. But something that many fans might not realize is that characters and themes in the book were based on earlier historical traditions. So while there are several areas of overlap between the magical world of the Potter books and Renaissance traditions that played major roles in the development of Western science, such as astrology, natural philosophy, natural history, botany, I'm going to focus this evening primarily on one subject: alchemy. You can, of course, learn more about the other traditions by looking at the NLM's exhibit here, or their website. So I focus on alchemy primarily because I am a historian of 16th and 17th century alchemy, and medicine as well. and it's just what I know, but also because J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, explicitly singled out alchemy as a major influence on her writing. She said, "I've never wanted to be a witch, but an alchemist. Now that's a different matter. To invent this wizard world, I've learned a ridiculous amount about alchemy. Perhaps much of it I'll never use in the books, but I have to know in detail what magic can and cannot do in order to set the parameters and establish the story's internal logic." Alchemy, however, is terribly misunderstood and has often been misrepresented. So as we tackle this hairy subject today, we will do so by breaking it down into several different topics. First, we'll try and briefly answer the questions, what was alchemy, and what does it have to do with the Potter universe? We'll then focus on some images and imagery from various alchemical texts, and we'll conclude by discussing what such imagery meant and what it had to do with the history of science. We begin, however, with our very first question. So put down your butterbeer, pumpkin juice, or chocolate frogs, and get ready to stand up with Hermione-like enthusiasm. The first question is, what is the major difference between the titles of the UK and the US edition of the first Potter book? I think it was right here. Gryffindor.
So the UK is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and the US is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone.
That is correct. The US edition, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and the UK edition is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. When Scholastic Corporation bought the rights to sell the first Harry Potter book in the US, they didn't think that children would want to read a book with the word philosopher in the title. Apparently because philosophers are boring and nerdy. I'm not sure why. So they basically forced Rowling to find a new title. While the term Sorcerer's Stone is practically meaningless, the term Philosopher's Stone comes from a rich tradition that stretches back through an enormous swath of history, and it's as good a place as any to start discussing the history of alchemy. In short, the Philosopher's Stone was a substance or object which alchemists believed would transmute or change base metals, tin, lead, copper, into gold or silver, and that it might even give the power to heal all diseases and grant exceptionally long life to those who owned or made it. For many, acquiring or synthesizing the Philosopher's Stone was the highest goal of alchemy. Alchemy, however, wasn't merely the search for the Philosopher's Stone. There were also other elusive substances, such as the so-called alkahest, a universal solvent that would dissolve all substances that was sometimes alleged to have wonderful medical qualities. And of course, you've got to come up with an explanation for how you can keep it if it dissolves all substances. So likewise, in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, the word alchemy was something of an umbrella term under which a variety of proto-chemical disciplines and artisanal traditions existed. These involved practices like distillation, in which you would make alcohol, strong acids, etc., metallurgy, dye making, various assaying practices like cementation and cupellation to discern the purity of gold or silver, and also eventually certain medical practices. It really wasn't until about the late 17th, 18th centuries that there was a firm distinction between the terms alchemy and chemistry. And alchemy then began its slow fade into irrelevance and was generally regarded by modern people as pseudoscience. So if that's the end of alchemy, where was its beginning? To find where alchemy came from, we have to travel back to Hellenistic Egypt in the early Christian period, in about the 1st century. Before this time, the Egyptians had developed sophisticated methods of working with metals, including the making of alloys and the synthesis of artificial gems, And these processes made their way to Hellenistic Alexandria. The first texts that we have that bear witness to this tradition date from the 3rd century, and they're contained in the Leiden and Stockholm papyri. And these documents contain practical workshop recipes regarding metals, and importantly, the imitation of valuable metals like gold or silver. But the first truly alchemical texts discuss more than just practical recipes. They also contain a body of theory. And the first alchemical text we have that was written around this time was by Zosimus of Panopolis. So his text has recipes that were very similar to the earlier texts, but an attached philosophy and theoretical understanding of the nature of matter and change. And naturally, this was appropriated from earlier Greek philosophy. Zosimus's primary goal was the transmutation of metals. But when he describes these processes, he does so in a very secretive fashion. And such secrecy would become a hallmark of alchemical texts. So for instance, he used what the Germans later termed Decknamen, or cover names. And he described mercury as, quote, the silvery water, the hermaphrodite, that which flees without ceasing. As we will see later, this cryptic imagery was present throughout alchemy's entire history. So our next step on our crash course through the history of alchemy has to be in the medieval Islamic world. After the fall of Rome, we see a dramatic decline in the interest, a dramatic decline of interest in natural philosophy, of which alchemy was a part. So, and this was caused, among other things, by the destabilization of society within the time period that historians used to call the Dark Ages. So even though natural philosophy wasn't happening in the West, Islamic societies began to take a serious interest in Greek natural philosophy and medicine, and that included alchemy. To understand the many Greek and Latin texts from the ancient world, they were especially interested in medicine. They set to work on one of the largest translation efforts in history. This process of translation was hugely accelerated with the rise of the so-called House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And translation continued at a rapid pace so that by the year 1000, almost all of Greek medicine, natural philosophy, and mathematics had been translated into Arabic and was being studied and used. So this is one of the main reasons why most historians prefer not to call this period the Dark Ages. But in addition to simply translating and perpetuating Greek ideas, many individuals from this period made significant contributions to alchemy. And in fact, the very word alchemy comes from the Arabic, in which al is merely the definite article. So the word alchemia means the chemia, where chemia comes from the Greek. This is much like other words, algebra, alkali, algorithm, alopecia. Seeing if I can slip one by you guys, you future doctors. So one of the most influential Arabic alchemists was Jabir ibn Hayyan. This was later Latinized to Geber. He played a huge role in the history of alchemy, but he, like so many other alchemists, was a very mysterious figure. We don't know which of the writings attributed to him he actually composed, or if his writings were written by a huge number of people. Regardless, one of the most influential ideas in the Jabirian corpus was that everything is made of mercury and sulfur. So this was different from the ancient Greek idea, and especially Aristotle's view, that everything was made of earth, air, water, and fire. So the mercury-sulfur theory provided a theoretical explanation of transmutation. If all metals are simply a mixture of mercury and sulfur, all you have to do is alter the balance of the two metals in order to make different metals. And gold, for instance, was thought to be the most perfect balance of mercury and sulfur. So our next stop in our very brief history of alchemy is in the Latin West during the High Middle Ages. It wasn't until the 12th century when alchemy began to make its way to Europe, when Arabic texts were translated back into Latin. So probably the first alchemical text to be translated into Latin was a book given the title of De Compositione Alchemiae, or The Composition of Alchemy, which was translated from Arabic in the year 1144 by Robert of Ketton, an English monk who was working in Spain. Here are also some images from a later printing of one of the most famous medieval alchemical manuscripts, the Summa Perfectionis of Pseudo-Geber. So it was actually purported to have been written by Geber, that is Jabir ibn Hayyan, but was actually written in the 13th century by a guy named Paul of Taranto. So when alchemy came to the Latin West, it underwent major changes, partially in response to various rulers in France, England, and Italy banning the practice of transmutation, and perhaps in response to criticism of alchemy itself as the domain of liars and charlatans. Alchemical texts became increasingly secretive and allegorical. Authors hid their meaning from the uninitiated, and this being Christendom, religious language was often used, and this enhanced alchemy's status by molding it even further into a type of holy knowledge that could perhaps only be received as the gift of God. Sometimes authors argued it was only through personal revelation that you could understand how it was to transmute base metals into gold. So likewise, in the Renaissance, the relationship between alchemy and certain mystical quasi-religious philosophies, such as Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and the Kabbalah, became stronger. One especially famous document from such mystical traditions was the so-called Tabula Smaragdina, or the Emerald Tablet, as represented here in this image. And this brings us to our next question. For the respect of your prefects, can anyone tell me which character from Harry Potter has a name that is almost identical to the name of the alleged ancient author of the Emerald Tablet? It is the person who is pictured in the right-hand bottom corner. It looks like we need a hint. It is a female character in Harry Potter. We need another hint. I'm so happy about this. The alleged author's name was Hermes Trismegistus. I think it's back there.
Hermione Granger.
That is correct.
Which house? Ravenclaw. Thank you.
Hermes Trismegistus. So the Emerald Tablet and the so-called Corpus Hermeticum, the writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice great Hermes. Texts like this were thought to have a secret alchemical meaning. And according to one interpretation of the etymology of Hermione, it's just a feminine form of Hermes, or at least descended from the name. So in this mishmash of alchemy and mystical philosophy, passages like the following from the Emerald Tablet of Hermes were interpreted alchemically. The author wrote, "That which is below is like that which is above. That which is above is like that which is below. To do the miracles of only one thing. Of one only thing. The sun is its father, the moon its mother." And on it continues. Now, all evidence that we have suggests that this cryptic text was an Arabic document from the 8th century, and the original composition probably had absolutely nothing to do with alchemy. But such claims of authorship, or false claims of authorship, are strikingly common throughout alchemy. This brings us to our next question, which is about a similar so-called pseudepigraphical text, a text that was purported to have been written by someone but wasn't actually written by that person. Who was the famous alchemist who is alleged to have written an important alchemical text in the 14th or 15th century and was the basis for a character in the first Harry Potter book? I think right, pink shirt.
Oh, underneath, I am okay.
Sorry, Slytherin.
Was
Sorry?
it Nicholas Flamel?
It is Nicholas Flamel. So his name was Nicolas Flamel, and there actually was a real person who lived in the 14th century by the name of Nicolas Flamel. He was a scribe and manuscript seller. This, of course, was before the days of printing and movable type. So you can see the real Flamel's tombstone, should over here, at the Musée Cluny in Paris, or you can even visit his house, which was built in 1407, and I'm not sure if this is right, but I've heard it is the oldest standing house in the city of Paris. So long after the real Flamel was dead, an unknown author used Flamel's gravitas and his trustworthiness to lend authority and profitability to this text. Well, at least this is the English version of a text attributed to Nicholas Flamel. Nicholas Flamel, his exposition of the hieroglyphical figures which he caused to be painted upon an arch. It goes on. So, according to the book, Nicholas and his wife, Pernelle, received a mysterious old book from the biblical figure Abraham. And to understand it, they consulted a rabbi who understood the mystical Kabbalah. After years of work interpreting the text, Nicolas and Pernelle were allegedly able to transmute 1/2 pound of mercury into silver using a white type of the Philosopher's Stone. Later, they used a red variety of the stone to transmute mercury into gold. And they only did this 3 times in total. Even though this text was not written by the real Nicolas Flamel, the book is interesting in and of itself. Like the title suggests, it is an explanation of a large image covered in smaller symbolic images. Each of the panels represents a particular part of the process of making the Philosopher's Stone. And along with the images, Pseudo-Flamel included a great deal of commentary. So use of such images and imagery during this time period was very common. One of the earliest texts to incorporate the use of allegorical alchemical images was the Aurora Consurgens, or Rising Dawn. It's one of the most beautiful alchemical manuscripts you will ever see, in my opinion. So this leads us to question 4. Buckbeak, a hippogriff, had the head of an eagle and the body, hind legs, and tail of a horse. If his hind parts were replaced by a lion, what mythical creature would he have been?
Oh, wait, yo.
So, sorry, who was up first?
He was.
All
He
right,
was. I was going to say, Griffin?
it is a griffin. So here you have a male sun figure with a shield riding a lion, jousting with a female moon riding a griffin. Rapid fire question: who was the founder of the house associated with this mythical creature? That's right.
So that was correct?
That was correct. 1 point for Gryffindor. Godric Gryffindor was the founder of Gryffindor. Yeah. And there's speculation that Gryffindor means golden griffin in French, Griffin d'or. So impress all your friends with that. So here's another image of a bicephalous hermaphrodite arising from what the text tells us is a pile of putrefying eagles. And I just want to say, it's not a particularly politically correct term to use, hermaphrodite, but it's the word that's used all the way throughout throughout alchemy, from the time of Zosimus up until the 17th century. And usually it's this bicephalous individual, this two-headed individual representing both male and female characteristics. So this provides a good segue to our next question. According to one character in Harry Potter, this mythical animal can carry immensely heavy loads, and their tears have healing powers. I have no idea who's up
Phoenix.
first. That's right. A phoenix can carry immensely heavy loads, and their tears have healing powers.
Puff is calling me a job here.
So the phoenix was depicted in alchemical texts. Here's another image from the Aurora Consurgens. But let's do another question about a mythical creature. So make sure that you can see the image. Which mythical animal from the Potter series is pictured here in these authentic early modern images? I think it was Gryffindor.
The hippogriff?
That is not correct. I think back here, in the suit.
The basilisk.
No, sorry. I think he was up first.
Basilisk.
It is a basilisk. So many allege that the basilisk was hatched by a rooster from the egg of a serpent or toad, which is the opposite of a cockatrice. So here's a famous image from an alchemical text, Johann Daniel Mylius's Basilica Philosophica. And as you'd expect, in a title called the Basilica Philosophica, right at the very center we have a basilisk. Right here, as well as what appears to be a phoenix. Actually, that's not a phoenix. That one's probably a phoenix. This appears to be, I could be wrong, a pelican who is stabbing itself in its chest and feeding its young with its blood. I could be wrong about that, though. So here's another famous manuscript. Das Buch der Heiligen Dreifaltigkeit. Thank you. So this is another of my favorite alchemical manuscripts, published in the 15th century. So here is a regal hermaphrodite above what might be a golden basilisk. Another regal hermaphrodite. And these were pictured throughout this text alongside alchemical apparatus. So our next question has to do with some of this rich alchemical imagery. According to his chocolate frog card, this alchemist was partnered with Nicolas Flamel, was famous for his discovery of the 12 uses of dragon's blood, and as we learn from an article by Rita Skeeter, was, quote, a groundbreaking contribution to the International Alchemical Conference in Cairo.
Albus Dumbledore.
Albus Dumbledore. He defeated the dark wizard Grindelwald in 1945 and was considered by many to be the greatest wizard of modern times. So what does his chocolate frog card have to do with actual alchemy? Well, dragon's blood is one of the... It's a very commonly used image throughout alchemical texts. This first image is from a text called the Ripley Scroll, or the Scroll of George Ripley. And there are numerous of these scrolls throughout the world, and actually is a long scroll. If we were to roll it out, it would be 20 feet long. There's a great scholar at Princeton, Jennifer Rampling, who's done a lot of work on the Ripley Scroll. But as you can see, the dragon here is bleeding. And it's a classic image. So this other image is from Michael Myers' Viatorium. So in this text, we learn that the elephant's trunk is engorged with water, is wrapped up by a dragon-like serpent who drinks the elephant's blood, and after the liquid is removed from the elephant, it is weakened so that it becomes limp and collapses, crushing the serpent to a bloody pulp. Some have interpreted this as a highly sexualized metaphor. Don't think about it too hard. But just so you know that this is not too far-fetched, here is one of the most famous printed alchemical texts, the Rosarium Philosophorum, which is translated as the Rose Garden of the Philosophers. It's based on a manuscript, but this is an early printing. So as you can see, we still have these images of regal characters, suns and moons, but also their copulation and the love of, you can see, coitus, or conjunctio, or coitus. Yeah, just in case you didn't get it. Their conjunctio creates this, again, a two-headed hermaphroditical figure. And then eventually, this kingly, queenly figure. So, such sexual imagery, remember, goes all the way back to Zosimus. And alchemy, after all, does involve a lot of the joinings and minglings and separations of binaries, like mercury and sulfur. Some of the most famous printed alchemical images, however, are from the 17th century. In this wonderful text, which I believe the library here has a copy of, Michael Myers' Atalanta Fugiens, or Fleeing Atalanta. So in addition to the series of 49 emblems, such as this image, the text also contains a fugue for each emblem. This, I think, is maybe the most bizarre image from the text. So it might not be clear what's happening here. The image draws on classical mythology to depict the three fathers of Orion: Mercury, Apollo, and Vulcan. And to put this tenderly, they are becoming intimate with a bull's hide. And after each of them has finished their intimacy, Orion is birthed from this bull's hide. Now, I promise you that stuff like this will make more sense if you just hang with me a little while longer. But the next question is a visual challenge and will require your most careful observational skills. Here is an image from a famous alchemical text written by the pseudonymous author Basil Valentine. Basil Valentine is the nom de plume of a guy named Johann Tulda, who claimed to be Basil Valentine, writing several hundred years earlier than Tulda lived at the turn of the 17th century, so about the year 1600. So, it's clear that the lion on the right is biting the lion on the left. But what else is the lion on the right doing? I think back here. It is, but that's not the answer we're looking for.
Oh, it's like he's farting.
It looks like he's farting. And the lion is indeed farting.
Which house do you claim? Gryffindor. Gryffindor, okay.
1 point to Gryffindor. So, yes, it's exactly what it looks like. And yes, it's pretty gross. So here's a description of the image from a handwritten 17th century alchemical manuscript. And you won't be able to read that, but I'll read parts of it for you. It says, 2 women clothed riding on 2 lions, each with a heart in her hand. The right-hand lion farts on a company of young lions behind it. This lion, by her farting, signifies her aerial form. Now this brings us to our 10th question, and I'm not sure if anyone will know it, but who was the erudite author of these manuscript notes? Whoever gets this deserves an apple, but not dropped on the head. Right here in the front?
Sir Isaac Newton.
Sir Isaac Newton! The author of this text was none other than Sir Isaac Newton, co-inventor of calculus, author of the Principia Mathematica, who formulated laws of motion and gravitation and so forth. And this brings us to the final section of the talk today, in which we'll discuss what all of this wacky imagery meant. Now, there have been a lot of interpretations over the years about what this material, from the words on the page to the images to the music, what it all meant. For instance, one of the most influential views was developed by the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, who believed that the strange imagery and language didn't actually refer to tangible chemicals and compounds or to genuine attempts to transmute metals into gold, but rather to the spiritual transformation of the alchemist. He also believed that the alchemical process corresponded to the collective unconscious. So most historians of alchemy today don't accept the view that alchemy was nothing, or they don't accept the view that alchemy had nothing to do with tangible work in what we might call a laboratory. Newton and others read these alchemical texts and sought to interpret them as physical chemical processes. So you can already see here that Newton interprets the farting of the one lion as the aerial, perhaps vaporous or gas form of a given compound. That doesn't mean that alchemy had nothing to do with spirituality or religion. Indeed, practically all of Western alchemy was practiced when the prevailing worldview was Christianity. So likewise, literary interpretations of alchemy have often included themes of personal transformation. Perhaps the most obvious in the Potter books is none other than Neville Longbottom, who was transmuted from the worthless lead of an awkward and unsightly boy to the gold of a rugged, handsome man. Now, historians haven't yet deciphered exactly what Basil Valentine intended with his farting lion or precisely what Newton thought it showed, but there are many other areas from Newton's alchemy where we can see that he was definitely trying to decipher particular laboratory processes from alchemical texts. So let's look at another example so we can see how alchemical texts and imagery were interpreted in the laboratory. A good example of Newton's is his description of the creation of a so-called star regulus of antimony. By the way, basilisk basically means little king or regulus. So the star regulus of antimony was a substance that was used in several important steps along the way to the Philosopher's Stone in the work of multiple 16th and 17th century alchemists. And I won't read through this here, but you see that Newton is describing a very real process involving particular metals and particular heats. Each of the funky signs that you see down here actually represents a particular metal. So in previous work that I helped with on a project called The Chemistry of Isaac Newton, we've actually used Newton's recipe to go into the laboratory ourselves and create this so-called stare regulus. But what's actually happening here? In short, the text that Newton describes is the reduction of stibnite ore, that is antimony trisulfide, with a metal such as iron in a furnace to yield metallic antimony. When iron is involved in the heating and the reduction process, the antimony cools under its slag and crystallizes to make this starry pattern, which reflects light in all sorts of different ways, and it's pretty to look at. So this is the so-called royal diadem, or royal crown of alchemy. And where, you might ask, did Newton get this text from? Did he just create it himself, or was he interpreting other alchemical texts? And what does this have to do with the Philosopher's Stone? Comes from one of his favorite authors, Irenaeus Philalethes, which means peaceful lover of truth. Philalethes, as you have probably guessed, is the pseudonym of a guy named George Starkey, an American-born alchemist who attended Harvard College before moving to London. So Philalethes wrote in a text called the Introitus Apertus, which is translated into English as the open entrance, pictured over here. So Philalethes wrote, "This chaos is called our arsenic, but in diverse respect, because our matter undergoes various states before our regal diadem is extracted from the menstrual blood of our whore." I'm so sorry to leave you with that image. So learn who the comrades of Cadmus are, and who the serpent who ate them, and what the hollow oak on which Cadmus transfixed the serpent. Learn what the doves of Diana are, which conquer the lion by beating him. The green lion, I say, which is really the Babylonian dragon, killing all by means of his venom. So I can't get into everything here, but in general, when decoded, this is an extremely abbreviated and oblique recipe for the star regulus, and eventually a substance called philosophical mercury, which was supposed to be able to amalgamate with gold, but penetrate gold more deeply than normal mercury, and thereby break gold down to its primitive elemental constituents. So in this metaphorical passage, the sordid whore is raw stibnite, raw antimony ore. The menstrual blood is metallic antimony, from which you get the regal diadem, the star regulus of antimony. The green dragon and Babylonian dragon probably also refer to stibnite, while the eating of Cadmus's comrades refers to the addition of iron as a reducing agent. So, in other places, Philalethes described his method and said, what I'm doing here is basically driving people crazy with my riddles. Only the adept, only the initiated, only the worthy will know what this text means. So on the Chemistry of Isaac Newton website, there are some other experiments that we have recreated. Here's the web address if you're curious. So did Newton's alchemy have an influence on the rest of his scientific pursuits, you might ask? Well, research in this area is really in its infancy. But William Newman, a historian of alchemy and the leader of the Chemistry of Isaac Newton, has recently argued that Newton's optics, and in particular his analysis and resynthesis of white light, owed a significant debt to his alchemical work. And there might be other areas too, such as gravity, where alchemy played a role, but we can't really say for sure. If we look at other alchemists from this period, however, we'll find that many made important contributions to the development, for instance, of atomism. That's what my dissertation was on. I worked on a 17th century physician from Germany who used alchemical experiments in order to argue against Aristotle and Aristotelian science in favor of the idea that everything is made up of tiny particles. It's not like modern atomism exactly, but it has some similarities. So these individuals also made contributions to the understanding of elements, practical chemical processes, notions of mass balance, notions of empiricism. But there's another area where alchemy had a large influence in history, and that's medicine. So this should be the final question, unless we need a tiebreaker.
We could need a tiebreaker.
So this is also based off of a chocolate frog card. On his first trip to Hogwarts, Harry received a chocolate frog card depicting this alchemist who is particularly well known for his contributions to medicine. There was also a bust of him in the halls at Hogwarts.
Who was Dumbledore?
That is not correct, I'm sorry. I don't know who was second.
Gryffindor was second.
Was it Yorick the Oddball?
It is not.
Guy in the suit.
Wasn't it Nicholas Flamel?
It was not.
Come on, Hufflepuff. Come on.
Paracelsus?
Paracelsus. Exactly what I would expect from Hufflepuff. So Paracelsus, which means beyond Celsus, the ancient physician. He was also known as Philippus Theophrastus Aureolus Bombastus von Hohenheim. You could see why he chose Paracelsus. So he's a Swiss German. His work was particularly important within chemistry and medicine for the rejection of certain ideas gleaned from ancient authors like Galen and Aristotle. He believed instead that the observation of nature and experience should be the arbiter of truth. He believed that diseases were entities separate from the body rather than merely imbalances of the four humors. And he was a pioneer in the usage of minerals and metals as medicines. Now, in looking at Paracelsus's influence, you would not want to say that he was a modern who lived before his time, or the father of toxicology, as it says in his Wikipedia entry. He believed in a correspondence between the microcosm of the human body and the macrocosm of the world at large, an astrological correspondence. His philosophy of nature and medicine was largely based on the Bible, and a particularly bizarre interpretation for which he was heavily criticized in his own time. He also believed that the various parts of the body were each ruled by a so-called archeus that interacted with the stars. And he was heavily influenced by Renaissance traditions of natural magic. And there are reports that he was just crazy. There's one story of him lecturing to his amanuensis, the person who's writing things down for him, with a sword and attacking this individual. It could be spurious. You can make a pilgrimage to his grave in Salzburg. I highly recommend it. So as a historian, I believe that it would be just as wrong to say that Newton was an idiot because he practiced alchemy, as it would be to say that Paracelsus was a modern out of his time because he believed in the close observation of natural particulars and had iconoclastic ideas that challenged other notions of disease. When I look at someone like Newton or other individuals from this time period who were heavily invested in alchemy, individuals like Robert Boyle, Tycho Brahe. So I think that there is good reason for us to take these individuals and their work seriously. Not because we think we can actually create the philosopher's stone, something that modern science tells us is, for all practical purposes, impossible unless you can bombard something with neutrons. But it did have important influences on the development of science and medicine. And it helps us to view as best we can the world from the perspective of historical actors, rather than simply reading our own modern biases back into history. So that's all I have for you. There are obviously a lot of books out that are fantastic, in particular the rare books display at the front, which is absolutely beautiful. So for further reading on the history of alchemy, I particularly recommend this book, The Secrets of Alchemy by Lawrence Principe. It's one of the best places to start. And then there's some other books in here as well. Thank you so much for your attention. And it looks like Gryffindor
Yes.
is the winner.